Linda Curry was gasping for air. Her body trembled, her heartbeat racing and fading all at once. The man who held her, the one everyone believed was her protector, shouted for help. He looked terrified, desperate, a husband watching his wife die in his arms. An ambulance screamed through the neighborhood as paramedics fought to keep her alive. Neighbors watched from their doorways, seeing only tragedy, never suspecting what they were really witnessing. At the hospital, doctors rushed her into emergency care. They worked frantically. Oxygen, IV lines, adrenaline. But nothing made sense. Her vitals spiked and crashed in unpredictable waves. Her body was shutting down, yet there were no injuries, no visible cause. It was as if something invisible was destroying her from the inside out. Her husband stood by her bed, quiet now. Tears on his face. He said all the right words, that she'd been feeling sick, that he'd done everything he could, that he couldn't lose her. Doctors believed him. Friends comforted him. He was the devoted husband, attentive, caring, heartbroken. No one imagined that the man wiping tears from his eyes was the very reason she lay dying. Because while nurses scrambled to save Linda's life, the poison was already finishing its work. It moved silently through her blood, a killer so subtle that even the machines couldn't detect it. By the time anyone realized what was happening, it was too late. Her pulse faded, her breathing slowed, and the monitor's steady rhythm dissolved into a single, endless tone. And as doctors called the time of death, the man beside her lowered his head, not in grief, but in relief. Because for Paul Curry, the plan had worked. What began as love had become a weapon. A husband's care turned into a slow, calculated execution, one hidden behind smiles, sympathy, and the perfect image of devotion. In that sterile hospital room, surrounded by people trying to save her, Linda Curry never knew she was dying at the hands of the man who claimed to love her most. And that's where this story begins. Not with a murder discovered, but with a death disguised as love. At first glance, their marriage seemed enviable. Paul was a nuclear engineer, intelligent, methodical, a man of logic and precision. Linda, by contrast, was warm, social, and trusting, a devoted wife who believed in the good in people. They met while working at a Southern California nuclear power plant. It sounded like the start of a movie. Two professionals in the same building, drawn together by shared ambition and the spark of mutual respect. Paul was older, seasoned, confident in a way that made Linda feel safe. He spoke about security, about planning for the future, all the things that resonated with a woman who wanted stability after years of uncertainty. To her friends, Paul was the kind of man every mother hopes her daughter will marry. Reliable, steady, the kind of man who brings flowers without being asked, who volunteers to cook dinner after a long day. But Paul's charm wasn't affection. It was strategy, a mask he wore with flawless precision. Over time, subtle cracks began to form, little things Linda brushed off, the way Paul always needed to control the finances, or how he insisted on managing her prescriptions to keep her organized. Small red flags, the kind that are easy to overlook when you want to believe in someone. No one could have guessed that those small gestures were rehearsals for murder. From the moment Paul entered Linda's life, he studied her, not in the way a lover does, but the way a strategist studies his next move. Every conversation, every gesture was calculated. He learned her fears, her habits, her weaknesses, and most importantly, her trust. At first, there were no warning signs. He made her laugh. He told her she was special, that she was different from the others. He spoke of love in a language so convincing, it sounded like forever. But forever wasn't in Paul Curry's vocabulary. Control was, and control always comes dressed as care. He would insist on managing their finances because he was just better with numbers. He would prepare her meals because He wanted her to eat healthy. He'd even help her take her medicine when she felt sick, because he was just looking out for her. Sweet gestures, until you realize what they were really meant to do. Step by step, he was building ownership, not partnership. Because to Paul, love wasn't about connection. It was about control. Linda's friends noticed small things. They said Paul had a way of making her doubt herself, that he'd correct her stories, twist her memories, question her judgment. Gaslighting. Though at the time that word wasn't as common. They just called it strange. But what's strange at first becomes normal when you live inside it long enough. And Linda, ever the optimist, believed that if she just loved him enough, he'd soften. If she stayed patient, things would get better. But with Paul, things didn't get better. They got darker. He became obsessed with her life, and more specifically, the value of it. He talked about insurance policies, financial planning, future security. And Linda, trusting her husband, signed the papers he put in front of her. It seemed harmless, responsible even, until those same documents would later tell detectives everything they needed to know. Some nights, Linda confided in her sister, she said Paul's affection had changed. It was colder, distant. He wasn't the man she'd married. And sometimes, she had this unshakable feeling that he was watching her, even when he wasn't in the room. Was it paranoia, or was it her intuition fighting to be heard? It started quietly, a series of vague illnesses that came and went. Linda would complain of feeling dizzy, fatigued, nauseous. She thought it was stress, or maybe the side effects of medication. Paul, ever the concerned husband, would comfort her, offering her water, suggesting she rest. But the episodes became more frequent and more severe. Linda's co-workers began to notice she looked pale, thinner than before. She was losing weight. Her once bright eyes seemed dull, tired. And yet, every time she mentioned her symptoms, Paul was there to explain them away. He told her it might be allergies. He told friends she had anxiety. He told doctors she was prone to panic attacks. Every narrative he gave was carefully crafted, enough to sound plausible, enough to deflect suspicion. Behind closed doors, he was slowly erasing her, one dose at a time. Doctors couldn't find a clear cause. Her tests were confusing, sometimes normal, sometimes abnormal. It was like her body was betraying her one organ at a time. But Paul was always there, by her bedside, attentive, gentle. He'd whisper, "Don't worry, sweetheart, I'll take care of you." He'd bring her water, meals, medication, sometimes even insist she rest while he handled everything. And who wouldn't trust a husband like that? Who wouldn't believe that kind of devotion? But sometimes devotion is just disguise, and care is a method of control. Paul began telling friends that Linda was always sick, that she was fragile. He painted himself as the devoted caretaker, the man sacrificing his own comfort for his wife's well-being. He played the role perfectly. Too perfectly. When Linda started to recover briefly, Paul would remind her to take her medicine, and soon after the sickness would return. Doctors were baffled. Paul looked heartbroken. And Linda was fading. There's a kind of evil that doesn't shout. It whispers. It hides behind kindness, patience, and love. It hides in the hands that hold you when you're weak. The same hands that slowly drain your strength, drop by drop. What kind of man studies the woman he claims to love, only to turn her body into an experiment? What kind of husband calculates the perfect dose of poison and then smiles as he serves it with breakfast? This was no random act of rage, no crime of passion. It was a plan, cold, methodical, and precise. Paul Curry wasn't just another controlling husband. He was brilliant, and that made him deadly. He had access to scientific knowledge few people understood. He knew chemistry, biology, toxicology. He knew how the human body reacts to different substances, and more importantly, how to manipulate those reactions. He had spent years working in a controlled environment, studying systems where precision meant survival. A nuclear engineer understands better than anyone how to hide chaos behind order. And that's exactly what he did in his marriage. Every move was calculated, every word rehearsed, every symptom Linda experienced was data. In his mind, Paul Curry wasn't committing a crime. He was executing an equation. When Linda's health continued to spiral, Paul presented himself as the devoted caretaker. He took time off work to look after her. He kept meticulous notes about her medical appointments, appearing attentive and worried. Doctors began to see him as a model husband, a man doing everything in his power to support his ailing wife. But the deeper Linda's condition worsened, the stronger Paul's control grew. He managed her pills, her meals, her insurance paperwork. He controlled who could visit, who could call. Isolation disguised as protection. Her friends noticed the change. When they visited, Paul always hovered close, answering for her, finishing her sentences, smiling too perfectly. Was it protection or possession? Sometimes, when Linda spoke, he'd gently place a hand on her shoulder as if to comfort. Yet there was something about that touch, a subtle reminder of who held the power in the room. One afternoon, Linda's sister dropped by unannounced. Paul seemed startled. He hadn't expected company. The kitchen smelled faintly of chemicals, but Linda brushed it off, too weak to care. Her sister watched her take a sip of tea, and something about the scene felt wrong. Why was Paul watching her so closely? Why did his eyes never leave the cup? The days blurred together. Some mornings Linda would wake with nausea so violent she could barely stand. Other days she felt almost normal until Paul urged her to stay on her routine. And like clockwork, the sickness returned. It was as if her recovery depended on his permission. She began keeping small notes, private, hidden inside a book on her nightstand. Headache after dinner. Weak after tea. Felt dizzy after medicine from Paul. They were fragments, but fragments of truth. Pieces of a pattern she was too afraid to believe, because what kind of marriage needs a secret diary just to survive? Her doctor ran test after test. Nothing made sense. Blood work normal, vitals inconsistent, symptoms erratic. At times she'd improve, only to spiral again without warning. It baffled everyone, except Paul. He always seemed prepared, always one step ahead, always with an answer. That calm confidence once comforted Linda. Now it terrified her. One night she woke in the dark to the faint clatter of glass. From the doorway she saw Paul in the kitchen, mixing something into a cup. He turned, startled, and smiled. "Couldn't sleep," he said softly. "Making tea." Her instincts screamed at him, but fear silenced the sound. She took the cup. She drank. A week later, she collapsed. And when Linda was finally hospitalized, Paul was right there, hovering, comforting, explaining. He told nurses she was sensitive to medication, that she had a weak constitution. To the outside world, Paul Curry was the kind of man every patient would want by their bedside. But in reality, he was ensuring that the very system meant to protect her would never suspect him. But when Linda's sister arrived, she noticed something chilling. Paul was the only one who ever handled Linda's drinks, the only one who insisted on helping with her medications, and the only one who seemed strangely calm while her condition worsened. What if love isn't what's killing her? What if love is the weapon? Still, Linda couldn't confront him. She didn't want to believe it. She told herself she was imagining things, that stress was twisting her perception, that her husband couldn't possibly mean her harm, because believing the truth meant accepting the unthinkable, that the man she trusted with her life was taking it from her. Eventually, she began to hide her suspicion behind small acts, pouring out drinks when he wasn't looking, pretending to take pills and tucking them under her tongue, eating only what she prepared herself. And slowly, miraculously, she started to feel better. Her strength returned, her clarity sharpened, her body was fighting back, and for the first time she saw the pattern clearly. But Paul noticed too. He saw her improving, and that wasn't part of his plan. He became colder, more distant, sometimes silent for hours, then suddenly affectionate, as if resetting her trust. The manipulation was constant, a cycle of confusion and control. She didn't know it yet, but the danger was peaking. Because a man like Paul Curry doesn't lose control easily. And when he does, he becomes unpredictable. How long can you live in a house built on fear? How many chances do you get before one mistake ends it all? How do you run from someone who already knows every move you'll make? Linda was about to find out. And when she did, her fight for survival would ignite an investigation that no one saw coming. If there's one thing consistent in so many domestic murder plots, it's money. And Paul's motive followed the same dark logic. He had quietly taken out a large life insurance policy on Linda, worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. The paperwork was legitimate, the beneficiary details precise. He told her it was a safety precaution, something all responsible couples should do. Linda didn't question it. Why would she? After all, he was the responsible one, the man who handled the details. But behind that calm voice and tidy paperwork lay a chilling calculation. If Linda died, Paul would inherit not only her insurance payout, but her pension, her assets, and the image of a grieving husband too broken to be questioned. It was the perfect setup. All he needed was for her to die naturally. By 1994, Linda's health had deteriorated drastically. She could barely keep food down. Her fatigue was relentless. And then, one night, it all ended. Paul called 911 in the early hours of the morning, his voice panicked, his tone frantic. He told the dispatcher his wife wasn't breathing. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Linda Curry was pronounced dead at the age of 49. The cause? A heart attack, or so it seemed. Her death certificate listed it as natural causes. There were no signs of struggle, no obvious toxins, no evidence of foul play. Paul was devastated, or at least that's how it appeared. He gave interviews, attended her funeral, accepted condolences with quiet dignity. To everyone around him, he was the embodiment of grief. To him, it was mission accomplished. Months passed. Life moved on. Paul eventually collected Linda's life insurance money, just as he had planned. But not everyone was convinced. Linda's friends, the ones who had seen her decline, who remembered her confusion and fear in those final weeks, couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. They described her as vibrant, active, full of life before Paul entered the picture. They remembered how she used to hike, laugh, and plan trips, and how all of that faded once she married him. One friend said, Linda started to disappear the moment Paul took over her life. But without evidence, there was nothing anyone could do. Her death remained officially natural. Paul Curry moved on. He changed jobs. He started dating again. He built a new life, one founded on silence and deception. For almost 20 years, he got away with it, or so he thought. 2 decades after Linda's death, a new set of eyes would look at the old case file. A detective with the Orange County Sheriff's Department would notice something others had missed. A pattern buried in the medical records, and a toxic clue that science in the 1990s hadn't been able to detect. Detectives began to trace Paul Curry's life in the months surrounding Linda's death. What they found painted a troubling pattern: repeated attempts to increase her life insurance coverage, meticulous control of her finances, and a history of researching toxins online. Each discovery added another thread to a web that was slowly tightening. Was this careful planning or mere coincidence? Had love truly existed between them, or had it been a performance from the very start? Friends described Paul as attentive but detached, brilliant yet oddly cold. Co-workers recalled how he prided himself on logic and precision, traits that once made him admirable but now seemed unsettling. Investigators obtained search warrants. Computer forensics revealed pages about nicotine toxicity, how much could kill, how it could be masked in routine tests, how to mix it with sedatives. And then came the pivotal clue: nicotine levels in Linda's tissue samples that were far beyond what a smoker, or even accidental exposure, could explain. Forensic specialists confirmed it. The nicotine had been concentrated, delivered in a way consistent with poisoning. Who would know enough chemistry to do that? Who stood to gain the most if Linda Curry was gone? Financial documents provided the answer. In the months before her death, Paul Curry had renewed and expanded several insurance policies, some listing him as the sole beneficiary, totaling nearly $500,000. He had even filed to claim those benefits within weeks of her passing. That pattern, insurance, control, isolation, was no longer invisible. Detectives interviewed former colleagues and Linda's friends. Each conversation chipped away at Paul's image as the grieving widower. One colleague recalled how, even before the funeral, Paul asked about how long life insurance payments usually take. Another remembered him speaking coldly of financial stability after a tragic loss. The more they listened, the clearer the picture became. Years had passed since Linda's death. Paul had moved on, quietly living under the radar. Perhaps he believed the past was buried for good. But the investigators never stopped. They reviewed new forensic techniques unavailable in the early 1990s. With these advances, they could retest Linda's preserved tissue samples. The results were unmistakable: acute nicotine poisoning. And with that single confirmation, the narrative changed from tragedy to homicide. The district attorney authorized a full review. Surveillance, interviews, and evidence reconstruction began. Agents built a timeline: every purchase, every document, every hospital visit leading up to Linda's collapse. Piece by piece, Paul Curry's precision, once admired, became the map of his undoing. Then came the confrontation. Detectives approached him quietly, first with casual questions, then with the details he thought no one would ever find. Witnesses later said his composure faltered for the first time. Still, he denied everything, calmly, methodically, insisting Linda had been ill, that he had cared for her lovingly. Was he clinging to innocence or rehearsing the same story he had told himself for years? According to court filings, investigators confronted him with lab reports showing fatal nicotine levels, insurance paperwork bearing his signature, and computer records linking him to poison research. There was no visible reaction, just silence, measured and deliberate. Then, finally, words. "I didn't do this." But the evidence was now a chorus, not a whisper. On the day the warrant was issued, police cars lined the street outside his home. Neighbors watched as the once quiet man, who had charmed colleagues and claimed genius status, was led away in handcuffs. News cameras captured the moment. The case that had begun as a mysterious death had now become one of Orange County's most chilling domestic homicide investigations. What drives a person to plan so meticulously, to risk everything for money or control? Was it greed, obsession, or the cold calculation of a man who believed he could outsmart everyone, even science itself? As the cruiser doors closed and the cameras flashed, years of suspicion finally met justice in motion. The mask had fallen, And for the first time in a decade, Linda Curry's story had a voice again, spoken not by the man who tried to silence it, but by the evidence he left behind. When Paul Curry was brought into court, years of suspicion had hardened into something undeniable, a case built not on rumor, but on science, persistence, and time. According to court records and trial coverage, prosecutors presented their case as a puzzle that had finally found its missing piece. Linda Curry's death, they argued, wasn't sudden, nor was it natural. It was the end result of deliberate, methodical poisoning, driven by greed, control, and calculation. In the courtroom, the evidence spoke louder than emotion. Toxicologists took the stand. They explained how nicotine, in high concentrated doses, could be nearly undetectable. They described how sedatives found in Linda's system would have kept her still, unaware, as the poison entered her body. Charts, graphs, and chemical breakdowns replaced the soft words of sympathy that once surrounded her death. Could science speak for the victim when she no longer could? Prosecutors showed life insurance documents, each one signed by Paul Curry. They laid out the financial trail, policy renewals, handwritten applications, bank deposits. Curry had attempted to collect on the benefits shortly after Linda's death, even while her family was still grieving. Witness after witness described the same contradictions: his calmness during her illness, his lack of urgency in seeking medical help, his detachment at the funeral. The jurors listened, faces unreadable. Then came the defense. They painted Paul Curry as a misunderstood man, logical, intelligent, perhaps emotionally distant, but not a killer. They suggested Linda had underlying health issues, that her death had been a tragic medical mystery, not murder. They questioned the reliability of tissue tests conducted years after the fact, but the prosecution's timeline was precise, their story unbroken. If this was coincidence, why did every path lead back to him? Why did his research, his insurance records, and her symptoms all align too neatly to be random? Experts testified that the nicotine levels found in Linda's tissues were astronomically high, hundreds of times above normal exposure. A medical examiner explained that the concentration could not have been accidental. It was deliberate, measured, and timed. The courtroom grew heavy with silence as jurors saw the photographs. Not graphic, but haunting. Images of a vibrant woman who had trusted completely, contrasted with evidence of a plan executed in shadows. The prosecution's closing argument was simple but devastating. Paul Curry didn't lose his wife, the prosecutor said. He removed her. The defense countered with reason and doubt, arguing that time had blurred the facts, that science can err, that emotion could sway judgment. But by then, the narrative had crystallized: forensic evidence, financial motive, behavioral control, a pattern too precise to ignore. Days stretched into weeks as testimony continued. Chemists, insurance agents, family members, all forming a mosaic of motive and method, each piece fitting where the other left off. And then, after hours of deliberation, the jury returned. Reporters leaned forward. The courtroom stood still. Paul Curry remained motionless as the clock read the verdict. Guilty. First-degree murder. No visible reaction. No words. Just silence. The same silence that had followed him for years, now turned against him. Was this justice finally catching up to intellect, or the final move in a game he thought he had already won? As the gavel fell, Linda Curry's name was spoken one last time, not as a victim of circumstance, but as proof that even a perfect plan can fracture under the weight of truth. Years of questions had finally found their answer. The courtroom emptied, the verdict recorded, and for the first time in decades, the story had an ending. When the verdict was read, the courtroom emptied quietly. Reporters filed their stories, and the headlines spread through California. Husband convicted in wife's nicotine poisoning. A case that had begun decades earlier, dismissed, forgotten, almost erased, was now complete. Paul Curry was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described his actions as a betrayal of trust at the most intimate level. No outburst, no emotion, just a final acknowledgement of guilt sealed by law. Outside the courthouse, Linda's family stood together, not in celebration but in quiet relief. For them, this was not victory, it was closure. Years of unanswered questions had finally found resolution. Her name, once lost in medical reports and paperwork, was now restored to the record of truth. How many stories like Linda's remain untold? How many tragedies begin not with violence but with trust misplaced in the wrong hands? The case of Paul and Linda Curry forced many to look closer at relationships that appear perfect, at partners who control in subtle ways, and at how love can be used as a weapon when paired with calculation. Friends described Linda as kind, brilliant, and compassionate, the sort of person who believed deeply in others. That belief, her family said, was both her beauty and her downfall. As investigators later reflected, this was never just a case about poison. It was about control, manipulation, and the illusion of devotion. A man who presented himself as caring and intelligent, yet quietly orchestrated a plan that only science could one day reveal. What does it take for someone to value money more than a life? And how does a person look into the eyes of the one they vowed to protect, knowing what they've already planned to do? The courtroom faded into history, but the lessons remained. For every case like this, there are countless others, hidden in homes, masked by love, waiting for the truth to surface. And perhaps that's the lasting echo of Linda Curry's story. That truth, no matter how deeply buried, will always fight its way to light. It may take years, it may take persistence, but evidence never forgets, and neither should we. This is True Crime Wound, where every story cuts deep and every scar tells the truth. Subscribe for more real cases, true investigations, and the hidden motives behind the crimes that shocked the world. Stay curious, stay cautious, and join us as we uncover the next story, where love, lies, and death intertwine.